My name is Margot Hayes, and I am 66 years old. What I'm about to share is not just a story, it is the wound that split my life into two halves. The most shattering moment came on the day that was supposed to be my husband's farewell. I was standing by Ernest's casket, tears still wet on my face, when my phone buzzed in my trembling hand. I glanced down, expecting another message of condolence. Instead, 4 words appeared that turned my blood to ice. I'm alive. That's not me. For a second, I thought my grief had made me hallucinate. My knees buckled, and Doris, my dearest friend, had to steady me so I wouldn't collapse into the damp cemetery soil. My husband dead, buried before my eyes, was suddenly telling me he wasn't the one in the casket. I clutched my chest, gasping for air, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Then, before I could even comprehend, another message flashed across the screen. Don't trust our sons. They're watching. In that instant, the world spun. My sons, Charles and Henry, were standing just a few feet away, their black suits sharp, their faces solemn, almost too solemn. Were they grieving or performing? I felt as though invisible hands were closing around my throat. My husband's voice, was it his voice, his words, or someone else's cruel trick, had risen from the grave to warn me against my own flesh and blood. That was the exact moment my soul cracked, because deep down, something in me already knew. Ernest's death was no accident. Before I take you any further into the darkness, let me pause and turn to you. Have you ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most? Have you ever felt your heart tear apart in 2 directions, one half desperate to cling to love, the other half screaming that love has been poisoned? Tell me in the comments, because I know I am not alone. And please, follow along with me until the end, because this story is not just about betrayal, it is about survival, about a mother forced to face the unthinkable truth about her own children. If you've ever loved, lost, or been lied to, then you will understand me. Now, let's go back to where it all began. I met Ernest when I was 24 years old, in a small town called Spring Creek. Life there was modest, dusty roads and wooden porches, where neighbors knew your name and your sorrows. I was a girl with calloused hands from scrubbing other people's floors, carrying the weight of a sick mother on my back. He was a quiet young man repairing bicycles in the small shop his father left behind, grease always staining his palms. We were poor, but when his shy smile met my eyes for the first time, I knew I had found something worth more than gold. I remember the exact day, Tuesday morning, the sky pale with the promise of rain. I wore my faded green dress, its seams stretched thin from years of use, and shoes that barely held together. Ernest stepped out of his shop, wiping his hands on a rag, and said almost timidly, "Good morning, Margot. Need me to check your bike?" I didn't even own a bike, but I blurted out some excuse just to keep talking to him. That small lie became the truth of my future. From that day forward, we walked under the old oak tree in Town Square Park, whispering promises of forever into each other's ears. And soon, those whispers became vows spoken before God in a simple wedding that smelled of wildflowers and hope. The first years were hard. We moved into a small 2-bedroom house with a tin roof that rattled and leaked whenever the storms came. On rainy nights, we set pots across the floor to catch the drips. We should have been miserable, but those nights are the ones that glow brightest in my memory. Ernest would make a game out of rearranging the pots, and we'd laugh until our sides ached. We had almost nothing, but somehow, we had everything. Then came our boys. When Charles was born, I thought my chest would explode from joy. He had Ernest's big eyes, wide and curious, and my smile curling at the edges. 2 years later, Henry arrived, perfect in every way. I poured every ounce of my being into those children. I worked myself raw sewing clothes for the ladies in town, patching together pennies to keep food on the table. Ernest took them fishing on Sundays, teaching them how to cast lines, how to mend a hook, how to live with patience. He read them bedtime stories by lantern light, his voice gentle and steady. I thought we had built a fortress of love around our family, but even fortresses crumble from within. As the years passed, Charles grew restless. He was always asking, "Why don't we have a car like the Petersons? Why is our house so small? Why can't we live in the city?" Ernest would smile patiently, but I saw how those questions sliced into him. When Charles turned 18, Ernest offered him the chance to work at the bicycle shop, to carry on the Hayes name. Charles sneered. I'm not going to get my hands dirty like you, Dad. I'm going to be someone important. I'll never forget the way Ernest's eyes dimmed that night as he stared at the stars, silent and sad. Henry, always the shadow trailing after his brother, followed the same path. Both boys left Spring Creek for the city, chasing wealth and power. At first, I was proud, how could I not be? They wore tailored suits, drove shining cars, and spoke with the confidence of men who had conquered the world. But pride curdled into sorrow as their visits grew fewer, their voices colder. They brought expensive gifts, but no warmth. They looked at us as if we were relics of a life they wanted to erase. And then came Jasmine, Charles's wife. She arrived in stilettos that sank into our dirt yard, wearing a red dress worth more than everything in my kitchen combined. She shook my hand as though she were touching something dirty. At dinner, she barely nibbled at the meatloaf I had poured love into. I overheard Charles whisper to her, "Next time, we'll just take them to a restaurant." That one sentence shattered me. He was ashamed of me, ashamed of us. Still, I clung to hope. I told myself they were just busy, that life in the city had made them forget their roots for a while. Ernest, though, saw clearer than I did. "Money has changed our boys, Margot," he said one night as we sipped bitter coffee on the porch. "We aren't enough for them anymore." I didn't want to believe him. I wanted to believe love was stronger than greed, that family ties were unbreakable. But standing at that graveside decades later, clutching my phone as those shocking words appeared, "Don't trust our sons," I realized my husband had been right all along. The fortress we had built wasn't destroyed from outside enemies. It had been poisoned by the very children we raised. I can still see that day so clearly, the way my heart swelled with the kind of hope only youth can hold. Ernest and I had nothing but our hands and our dreams, yet we believed that was enough. And for many years it was. The house we lived in was small, 2 bedrooms under a roof patched with tin that rattled like a drum when storms rolled through. But each creak of the floorboards, each patched corner of the walls carried laughter, whispered secrets, and nights where love made us forget hunger. When it rained, the leaks forced us to scatter pots across the floor. Some wives would have cursed that roof, but Ernest turned it into a comedy act. He would leap across the room like a circus performer, sliding a pot under each drip with dramatic flair, making our boys squeal with laughter. "There, caught another one," he'd say proudly, as if he had saved the entire house. I laughed so hard sometimes that tears blurred my vision. It wasn't comfort we lived on. It was joy, pure and undiluted, the kind only shared struggle can create. Ernest worked sunup to sundown in that bicycle shop. His father's old place was barely holding together, tools scattered, wood counters worn thin. Yet Ernest's hands grease-stained and steady breathed life into every bent wheel and squeaky chain. Neighbors said he had a gift, that he could fix anything with patience and care. And maybe they were right. When he came home at night, his clothes reeking of oil, his smile still had room for me. He'd wrap his arms around me, leaving streaks of grease on my dress, and whisper, "One day, Margot, all of this will be worth it." Meanwhile, I sewed clothes in our kitchen by lamplight. My needle slipped through fabric while our boys slept, my fingers calloused from long hours of stitching. I'd listen to the faint rumble of Ernest's snores from the next room and smile because, in that small sound, I heard the promise of safety. We weren't rich, but we were rich in ways money can never measure. When Charles was born, I thought I'd never stop crying tears of happiness. He had Ernest's wide eyes, full of wonder, and I remember staring into them for hours, thinking, "I will protect you forever. I will give you everything I never had." 2 years later came Henry, a baby as perfect as the first. Suddenly, our home felt fuller, louder, and infinitely more alive. My days were consumed with bottles, diapers, and lullabies, and I gave myself to motherhood without hesitation. I sacrificed my rest, my youth, even my body to raise them with tenderness. Ernest became the father every man should be. He took the boys fishing at the river, his large hands guiding theirs as they learned to cast lines into the water. He built them wooden toys from scraps in the shop. He told them stories at night, his voice turning into magic as their little eyes drifted shut. I thought we were invincible then, the 4 of us bound together by something unbreakable. I told myself no matter what storms came our way, we would endure because we had each other. But time changes children in ways a mother can't always see coming. Charles grew restless first. He was always asking questions that cut like knives. "Why don't we have a car like the Johnsons? Why is our house so small? Why can't we move to the city where people actually matter?" At first I thought it was childish curiosity, but when he turned 18 and Ernest offered him a job at the shop passing down the family trade, Charles's rejection was cold as steel. "I don't want to get my hands dirty like you, Dad. I'm going to be someone important." The look on Ernest's face that night haunts me still. He sat on the porch afterward, silent, staring at the sky. I joined him, touching his arm. "He's young, Ernest. He'll come around." But Ernest's jaw was tight, his eyes dim. I think in that moment, he realized the boy we raised with calloused hands and open hearts had chosen another path. Henry, as always, followed Charles. He idolized his older brother, mimicking everything from his way of speaking to the way he brushed his hair. When Charles left for the city to pursue business, Henry followed within months. Just like that, our house grew empty. Their laughter, once the heartbeat of our nights, vanished into silence. At first I was proud. When they came home in sharp suits, driving polished cars, speaking about investments and returns, I thought we had given them wings. I believed they had broken the cycle of poverty Ernest and I had been trapped in. But pride curdled into something else. Their visits grew shorter. Their eyes grew colder. They spoke of money with a reverence they never gave to us. When Charles married Jasmine, I felt the last thread begin to fray. She was beautiful, elegant, but her eyes held disdain like a hidden blade. The first time she stepped onto our porch in stilettos, her heels sank into the dirt. She grimaced as if the ground itself offended her. She shook my hand delicately, the tips of her fingers barely grazing mine. That night, she pushed her dinner plate away after taking 2 bites of the meal I had spent hours preparing. I caught Charles whispering to her, "Next time, we'll take them to a real restaurant." He thought I couldn't hear, but I did. The words landed harder than any blow. Henry never married, but he didn't need Jasmine to push him away. He became a mirror of Charles, busy, distracted, forever rushing off to meetings and clients. He would sit in our living room with his phone glowing in his hand, barely looking up when I tried to talk to him. "Mom, I have to go," he would say, already halfway out the door. Family Sundays stopped. Christmases became hollow exchanges of expensive gifts no one needed. Ernest and I aged alone, sipping coffee on our porch as silence replaced the chatter of our sons. "Do you know the saddest part, Margot?" Ernest said one night, his voice heavy with something deeper than exhaustion. "It's not that they have money. It's that money has convinced them we don't matter anymore." I held his hand tightly, refusing to let those words sink in. "They're just busy. They'll come back to us." But Ernest's eyes told me the truth. I was too afraid to face. We had already lost them. The distance between us and our sons didn't just grow, it hardened into a wall I could no longer climb. When they came home, it wasn't to laugh with us or share a meal. It was to flaunt the lives they had built, the glittering world they believed proved their superiority. Charles in particular had a way of looking around our home that pierced me. His gaze slid over the faded curtains, the creaking wooden chairs, the patched floorboards as though each imperfection screamed failure. He never said it directly, but I could hear it in the way he sighed, in the way his voice tightened. "Mom," he said one evening during a rare visit, "you and Dad should think about moving somewhere better. This house is falling apart. You deserve something modern. Something respectable." Respectable. The word burned. To him, the place where Ernest and I had raised him was embarrassing, not sacred. I opened my mouth to answer, but Ernest beat me to it. His voice was steady, but I knew the hurt it carried. "Charles, this house is where your mother and I built our lives. Every crack, every creak, every mark on these walls means something. It is not falling apart, it is standing because of us." Henry, ever the echo of his brother, chimed in softly. "Still, Dad, maybe he's right. You'd be more comfortable in a place that's new. A retirement community, maybe." A retirement community. Those 3 words slammed into me like a slap. I looked at them both, my throat tight. "Are you saying you want to put us in a home?" No, Charles replied quickly, his fake smile smoothing over the insult. "It's just practical. You'd have people to look after you. Medical care, activities. Don't you want that?" I shook my head, unable to speak. It wasn't practicality they were after, it was convenience. They wanted us out of the way. The weeks that followed became a tug-of-war I never asked for. Charles arrived one afternoon with documents already drawn up. He laid them on the table as if he were offering a gift. "This house, Mom and Dad, is worth maybe $1,000 at most. If you sell, I'll add money from my savings so you can move into something better. Think of it as an early inheritance." "An early inheritance?" I repeated, the words foreign and ugly on my tongue. "We're still alive, Charles. Since when do children demand their inheritance while their parents are breathing?" Ernest's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Son, when your mother and I pass, everything we own will be yours. But while we live, this house is ours. Our decisions are our own." Henry leaned forward, his tone falsely gentle. "Dad, you're 70. Still working at that shop every day. Don't you think it's time to rest? An accident at your age would be dangerous." Ernest's eyes darkened. "Working isn't a burden. It gives me purpose. It keeps me alive." But I saw something then, an impatience in Henry's expression, a flicker of urgency in Charles's. It wasn't concern for their father's health. It was hunger. Hunger for control, for money, for a future where Ernest and I no longer existed as obstacles. The pressure escalated. They brought real estate agents to the house without asking us, men with clipboards and calculating eyes who measured the rooms while I stood frozen in the kitchen, my hands shaking over the sink. They had the house appraised without our permission. They spoke openly, as though Ernest and I were children who couldn't understand. "Look, Mom," Charles said one uncomfortable dinner, his voice smooth as oil. "Jasmine and I have been talking about having kids soon. You'll be grandparents, but raising children in this economy is hard. If you sold the house, that money could help all of us. Think of it as passing the torch to the next generation." I stared at him, my fork trembling in my hand. "You're asking us to sacrifice our home so you can raise your children?" He didn't even flinch. "It would be best for everyone." Best for everyone, meaning best for him. Ernest remained silent through most of that dinner, but when they left, he sat with me on the porch until dawn. His voice was heavy with something darker than disappointment. "Margot, I don't think this is just ambition. There's something more, something dangerous behind the way they're pushing." I tried to brush it off. I told myself he was tired, that he was seeing shadows where there were none. But in the pit of my stomach, fear stirred. Because a mother can lie to herself about many things, but she cannot ignore the shift in her children's eyes the way love is replaced by calculation. What I didn't know then was how right Ernest had been. The storm brewing inside my sons was darker than anything either of us could have imagined. And soon, it would destroy everything we had built. The Tuesday morning that shattered my life began like any other. Ernest rose before dawn, the sound of the floorboards groaning under his steady steps as he moved through our little house. I was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to my elbows, mixing ground beef for his favorite meal, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, planning to surprise him for lunch. It was such a small thing, but after 42 years together, it was those little gestures that carried our love. The phone rang suddenly, its shrill cry cutting through the quiet like a knife. I dried my hands on my apron and picked up. "Mrs. Hayes?" The voice was unfamiliar, urgent. "This is Memorial Hospital. Your husband has been in a serious accident. You need to come immediately." For a moment, I couldn't process the words. They blurred together, meaningless sounds. Then they sank in, and my knees buckled. What accident? What happened? Is he alive? "Ma'am, please come as soon as possible," the voice said quickly. "We'll explain everything here." The receiver slipped in my sweaty hand. My neighbor Doris, who had come over to return a casserole dish, grabbed me by the shoulders. "Margot, what is it?" "Ernest," I gasped. "They said, accident, hospital." I was trembling so violently I couldn't hold the car keys. Doris drove me herself, her lips moving in silent prayers the whole way. The road stretched endlessly, every stoplight a dagger, every passing second a lifetime. My mind refused to accept it. Ernest was careful, meticulous. He had spent decades in that shop without a single serious injury. He knew every screw, every wire, every machine, like the lines on his own hands. How could this happen? When we arrived, Charles and Henry were already in the waiting room. That fact alone froze me. How had they gotten there before me? The hospital had called me. I was Ernest's emergency contact. No one else should have known yet. "Mom," Charles said, rushing forward with arms that closed around me too tightly, almost rehearsed. "Dad, it's bad. A machine exploded at the shop. He's in critical condition." Henry stood nearby, his eyes red as though he had been crying, but something about his expression struck me. His lips pressed together, not trembling with grief, but twitching with tension. like someone waiting for news of a deal, not the fate of a father. The nurse appeared and explained, "Only immediate family, one at a time, for 5 minutes. He's stable, but critical." When I entered Ernest's room, my heart collapsed. My husband, my rock, my companion for 42 years was unrecognizable beneath the machines. Bandages covered his arms and most of his face. Tubes snaked into his body, beeping monitors surrounded him. His chest rose and fell mechanically, each breath borrowed, each sound a reminder of fragility. I forced my legs forward and took his hand, the only piece of him that looked untouched. "Ernest," I whispered, my tears falling onto his sheets. "It's me, my love. I'm here. You're going to make it through this, like you always do." For one fleeting moment, his fingers twitched around mine, the faintest squeeze. His eyelids fluttered as if he were fighting to wake. My heart leapt. "Nurse! He's responding!" But when she came in, she shook her head. "Sometimes there are involuntary spasms. Don't give yourself false hope." False hope. But I knew my husband. That squeeze was him trying to tell me something. The next 3 days blurred into a nightmare. I refused to leave his side, sleeping upright in a stiff chair, clutching his hand through every rise and fall of the monitors. Charles and Henry rotated by my side, but their presence felt wrong. They spent more time cornering doctors, asking about medical insurance and life insurance policies, than sitting with their father. I overheard fragments that chilled me. "His life insurance covers $50,000. Charles's voice low and calculating. "Workers' comp, up to 75. Henry whispered on a phone call, pacing the corridor. I confronted Charles on the second day. "Why are you talking about money? Your father is still alive." "Of course, Mom," he said quickly, his face slipping into that practiced smile. "We just need to be prepared. For you." Prepared. That word curdled in my stomach. On the third day, the doctor called us into his office. His eyes were kind, but heavy. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, "your husband's injuries are severe. The burns have become infected. The head trauma is more extensive than we first thought. He is in an induced coma. Realistically, we must prepare for the possibility that he may never wake up." My world tilted, the floor dropping out from under me. No, we can't give up. Try everything, no matter the cost, no matter how long it takes." Charles exchanged a glance with Henry, one of those silent conversations that lasts a lifetime in a second. "Mom," Charles said gently, "we have to be practical. Dad always said he didn't want to be a burden. He wouldn't want to live like this." "A burden?" My voice cracked into fury. "He is your father. He is not a burden. He is the man who gave you everything you have." Henry leaned forward, his tone almost rehearsed. "Mom, the bills will be enormous. They could wipe out your savings." Money again. Always money. My husband was lying on the edge of life, and all they could see were dollar signs. That night, alone in the hospital room, I pressed my lips to Ernest's hand and whispered, "Fight, my love. Fight. Please." And for the second time I felt his fingers twitch, his lips move faintly as though he were trying to speak. I called the nurses, frantic, but by the time they arrived, he was still again. "Muscle spasms," they said. But my heart knew better. Ernest was trying to tell me something. 2 days later, at 4:37 inches the morning, the machines screamed. Alarms shrieked, nurses rushed, and I was pulled into the hallway as doctors tried to revive him. I clutched the wall, sobbing, praying, begging. For 40 minutes they fought. And then, silence. "Time of death, 4:37 a.m., the doctor announced. The world ended. I fell to my knees, the sound ripped from my chest more animal than human. They let me into the room, where Ernest's body was still warm. I collapsed onto him, holding him as if my arms could pull him back. "Don't leave me," I whispered into the bandages. "Don't leave me, not like this." An hour later, Charles and Henry arrived too quickly, almost as if they had been waiting for the call. They came not with tears, but with papers. Phone numbers of funeral homes, insurance claims already started. Charles patted my shoulder. "We already contacted Spring Creek Funeral Home. They can handle everything today." "Today?" I choked. "He just died." "It's what Dad would have wanted. Something simple, no fuss." But Ernest deserved more than a rushed burial. He deserved respect. He deserved love. And in that moment, watching my sons talk about policies and logistics as if their father were just an expired document, I felt the first undeniable crack of suspicion. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The morning of the funeral arrived draped in heavy clouds, as though the heavens themselves mourned Ernest. I wore my only black dress, the one I had last worn at my mother's funeral decades earlier. My fingers trembled so badly that Doris had to help me fasten the small buttons down the back. "Be strong, Margot," she whispered, brushing my hair with motherly tenderness. "Ernest would want to see you strong." But my body was hollow. The man who had been my anchor for 42 years lay cold in a casket, and I felt like a boat cut loose at sea. When we arrived at the cemetery, the emptiness struck me like a slap. I had expected neighbors, old friends, earnest customers who had trusted him with their bicycles for decades. Instead, only Charles, Henry, Jasmine, Doris, myself, and the pastor stood there. That was all. For a man who had given 70 years of his life to Spring Creek, the absence of the community he loved was a wound deeper than death. "Where are his co-workers? The neighbors?" I asked, searching the small crowd with disbelief. Charles didn't meet my eyes. "We didn't want to trouble anyone. Dad was a private man. He'd have preferred something small." That was a lie. Ernest was many things: humble, quiet, steady, but never private when it came to people he cared for. He loved his community. He would have wanted them there. Why had Charles chosen to keep them away? The service itself felt mechanical. The pastor's words about eternal rest washed over me like meaningless noise. I wanted Ernest beside me, not spoken about in past tense. Charles checked his watch more than once. Henry shifted restlessly, his gaze darting around as if the ceremony were an inconvenience. And Jasmine, she dared to lift her veil and check her phone while the pastor prayed. I tried to focus on Ernest's memory, but bitterness burned through my grief. They were burying their father, and they looked bored. My nails dug into my palms until I thought I'd draw blood. When the pastor finished and it came time to scatter dirt over the casket, my legs refused to hold me. Doris had to steady me as the sound of earth-striking wood cracked through the silence. Each dull thud echoed like a final heartbeat, driving the truth deeper. He was gone. That was the moment my phone buzzed in my purse. I thought it was Doris sending me strength. But when I pulled it out, my world split in two. The message read, "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket." The ground swayed under me. I gripped Doris's arm, my lungs struggling for air. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the phone. With trembling fingers, I typed, "Who are you?" The reply came instantly. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." The phone slipped from my hands, falling into the damp grass as though it burned me. Doris bent to pick it up, but I yanked her back. "No, leave it." My voice cracked too loud, and Charles's head snapped toward me. "Mom?" he asked, walking closer, his expression painted with concern, but concern I no longer trusted. "Are you okay?" I shoved the phone into my purse, hiding it like a guilty secret. "I'm fine. Just dizzy," I lied. "I need to go home." On the drive back, the words pulsed through me like poison. "I'm alive. Don't trust our sons." Was someone playing a cruel joke? Or was Ernest truly alive somewhere, hidden, waiting for me to uncover the truth? And if he wasn't alive, then who knew so much about my son's behavior? That night, the house felt like a tomb. Ernest's coffee mug still sat on the table. His pillow still carried his scent. His tools waited on the porch as if he'd walk in at any moment. I sat at the kitchen table, clutching my phone, staring at those words over and over. My mind reeled back through the details, the so-called explosion. But when Ernest left for work that morning, he had kissed my cheek with the same smile he always wore. He was meticulous about maintenance. In 40 years, he had never once had a machine fail on him. How could one suddenly explode badly enough to put him in the ICU? And how had Charles and Henry arrived at the hospital before me? I was the first person called, unless they already knew something I didn't, unless they had been waiting for it. My pulse raced. I needed answers. I went to Ernest's old desk in the corner of the living room. Inside, neatly stacked, were our important papers: the deed to the house, the shop license, our savings account records. I opened the metal box where Ernest kept insurance documents. There it was, the life insurance policy Charles had mentioned at the hospital, $50,000. But something was off. It had been updated just 6 months earlier. My hands shook as I flipped through it. Ernest had never told me about increasing his insurance. Why would he do that without speaking to me? And then, another paper slipped free, a workers' compensation policy I had never seen, purchased only 2 months before his death. It promised $15,000 in case of accidental death on the job. Ernest, who hated paperwork, who avoided insurance agents like the plague, had suddenly signed multiple policies right before dying in a supposed accident. My stomach twisted. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated again. A new message. Check the bank account. See who's been moving money. I froze. Whoever this was, they knew too much. Too many details. They weren't guessing, they were guiding me. The next morning, I forced myself to walk into the bank. Mrs. Thompson, who had known us for decades, looked up with watery eyes. "Oh, Margot, I'm so sorry about Ernest. He was a good man." "Thank you," I managed. "I need to see our account records." She pulled up the last 6 months. When I saw them, my blood ran cold. Large withdrawals had been made: $1,000 in January, $3,000 in February, $4,000 in March. Money I had never touched. "Who authorized these?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Your husband," Mrs. Thompson said. "He came in person, said it was for shop repairs." My head spun. Ernest never mentioned repairs that costly, and he never withdrew money without telling me. "Do you still have the signatures?" She handed me the receipts. At first glance, they looked like Ernest's handwriting, but something was wrong. His usual bold strokes were shaky, uncertain. I had seen that handwriting for over 40 years. I knew it wasn't his natural script. "Mrs. Thompson," I whispered, my throat tightening. "Was he alone when he came in?" She frowned, thinking. "Now that you mention it, once or twice one of your sons was with him. Charles, I believe. He said his father needed help with the paperwork because his eyes weren't so good anymore. But Ernest's eyesight had been fine with his glasses. He read the newspaper every morning without strain. He never asked for help with documents." My hands gripped the papers so tightly they wrinkled. A shadow of horror crept over me. My sons, my own sons. Were they behind this? That night, alone in the quiet house, another message appeared on my phone. The insurance was their idea. They pushed Ernest into it. It was a trap. I dropped the phone onto the table, covering my face with my hands as tears spilled freely. Ernest had always been right. He had sensed their change, their hunger. I had denied it, told myself they were still the boys I raised. But now, evidence piled around me like bricks in a prison. The insurance, the withdrawals, their eagerness at the hospital, their rush to bury him. And if those texts were telling the truth, my sons hadn't just betrayed their father, they had killed him. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the documents spread before me like puzzle pieces from a nightmare. Ernest's neat handwriting on old receipts, the shaky signatures on the bank slips, the freshly inked insurance policies. It was all wrong. My tears blurred the ink until the numbers swam like shadows on the page. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, the truth pressed closer. My sons had been circling Ernest like vultures. The next morning, another message appeared on my phone before I'd even had coffee. "Go to Ernest's shop, check his desk, you'll find proof." My heart pounded. Whoever this was, they weren't guessing. They knew. I drove to the shop, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. When I stepped inside, the air was heavy with oil and dust, but something was off. The place was too clean. If a machine explosion had nearly killed Ernest, where were the burn marks, the shattered pieces, the blackened walls? Instead, every machine stood perfectly intact: the welder, the compressor, the saw, not a single sign of damage. The lie was unraveling. I opened Ernest's desk drawer and froze. There, in his familiar scrawl, was a note dated 3 days before his death. "Charles insists I increase the insurance. Says it's for Margot's safety, but something feels wrong. I don't trust his intentions." My knees went weak. Ernest had known. He had felt it. Beneath it lay another note. "Henry brought papers for me to sign. Said they're for modernizing the shop. I don't understand. Why all the hurry?" My breath caught. My husband, who had trusted so deeply, had been pressured, cornered, deceived by the sons he raised. And then I saw the envelope. My name, written in Ernest's steady hand. With trembling fingers, I opened it. "My dearest Margot, if you are reading this, it means something has happened to me. I have noticed troubling changes in Charles and Henry. They are obsessed with money, with insurance, with the house. Jasmine fuels their greed. Yesterday, Charles told me I should be careful because, at my age, any accident could be fatal. I don't know why, but those words felt like a threat. If anything happens to me, don't trust them. Protect yourself. I love you forever. The letter slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the floor. My husband had tried to warn me, even in death. He had seen what I refused to see. I sank to the ground, clutching the letter to my chest. My sons, the babies I had rocked to sleep, the boys Ernest had taught to fish, were not just ambitious men. They were predators, and I was their next prey. That evening, Charles arrived unannounced, carrying a bottle of wine. He poured himself a glass without asking, his smile practiced but brittle. "Mom, I've been thinking about your future," he said, sliding into Ernest's chair at the table. "The insurance payout is already processing, 15,000, maybe more. With our guidance, we can invest it, triple it in a few years. You'll be comfortable." His eyes gleamed with hunger. I swallowed my rage and forced my voice steady. "And what do you think I should do with the money?" "You could buy a smaller house," he suggested smoothly. "Or better, move to a retirement community. Henry and I will handle the rest. You don't need to worry about money at your age." At your age. As if I were a burden, an obstacle to be managed. I stared at him, remembering Ernest's letter. My husband had been right. When Charles left, I locked the door and sat shaking at the table. Minutes later, my phone buzzed again. "Go to the police. Ask for Ernest's accident report. There are contradictions you need to see." The next morning, I walked into the police station, my pulse echoing in my ears. Sergeant O'Connell, a man who had known Ernest for years, greeted me kindly. "The report on my husband's accident?" I asked, my voice tight. "The explosion at his shop." His brows furrowed. He rifled through files, then looked up with confusion. "Mrs. Hayes, there is no accident report. Nothing from Ernest's shop. In fact, the hospital record says he was admitted for symptoms of poisoning." The floor dropped beneath me. "Poisoning?" I whispered. "Yes. Methanol, a toxic alcohol. Ingesting even small amounts can cause blindness, brain damage, death. According to the file, he had high levels in his blood." My chest constricted. All the air seemed to vanish. Poison. Not an explosion, not a tragic accident. Deliberate. "And why wasn't I told?" I demanded, my voice rising. "The hospital said immediate family requested confidentiality." O'Connell explained gently. "They claimed you were too fragile to handle the details." Immediate family. Charles, Henry. My stomach twisted until I thought I would be sick. They had hidden the truth, woven a story of explosions and machines, while their father lay dying from poison. I staggered out of the station, Ernest's letter burning in my pocket, the truth pounding in my skull. My sons had murdered him, and now they were circling me. That night, Henry came to visit. He brought flowers, his face arranged into false sympathy. "How are you, Mom? You look tired." "I'm fine," I said coldly, watching every flicker of his eyes. He leaned forward. "Charles and I have been talking. We think it's best if you sell the house soon. You need liquidity. The market's good now." "Liquidity?" I repeated, the word sour on my tongue. "Tell me, Henry, did you know your father wasn't in a work accident? Did you know he was poisoned?" For the briefest second, panic flashed in his eyes. Then it was gone. "What are you talking about? Mom, you're confused. Grief is making you imagine things." I stood, my voice shaking but strong. "I went to the police. There's no report of an accident, no explosion, just methanol in his blood." Henry froze, the mask slipping. His hand trembled, knocking over the coffee cup I had poured for him. "Mom, you shouldn't be doing this. It's dangerous for you. You need rest." He left quickly, making a phone call on the porch, his voice low but urgent. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I knew what he was doing. Later that night, my phone buzzed again. The longest message yet. "They're going to gaslight you. They'll try to prove you're paranoid. Don't eat or drink anything they bring. They want you gone next." I sat in the dark kitchen, Ernest's letter in one hand, my phone in the other, my tears falling silently onto the table. My sons had murdered their father, and now they were plotting to erase me too. The warning arrived less than 12 hours before the trap was set. Don't eat or drink anything they bring. They want you gone next. Those words burned into my chest like fire. I barely slept that night, sitting in the kitchen with Ernest's letter clutched in one hand and my phone in the other. Every creak of the house felt like a threat. Every whisper of the wind through the trees outside sounded like footsteps. The next morning, as if on cue, Charles and Henry arrived together. Jasmine trailed behind them, her perfume thick enough to choke me, her expression hidden behind a veil of false sympathy. They carried a bakery bag and a thermos. "Mom," Charles began with his sugary voice, the same one he used as a boy when he wanted something expensive for Christmas. "We're worried about you. You've been acting unusual." Henry set the bag of pastries on the table, sliding it toward me as though presenting an offering. "These are your favorites, from that downtown bakery you love." I stared at the bag as though it were a coiled snake. The words of the message echoed in my mind. "Don't eat. Don't drink." "And coffee," Jasmine added brightly, unscrewing the thermos lid. "The brand you like, fresh, strong. You should drink. Margot, you've lost weight." Her voice was soft, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. She pushed a steaming cup toward me, the dark liquid swirling like poison. My throat tightened. If I hadn't received the warning, would I have sipped it without question? Would that coffee have been my last breath? I forced a faint smile, pushing the cup back. "Thank you, but I already had breakfast." Charles's jaw clenched, almost imperceptibly. He quickly smoothed his face into concern. "Mom, you need to take care of yourself. We've spoken to doctors. They say it's common for someone your age, after such a loss, to develop paranoia." "Paranoia?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "Yes," Henry said gravely, leaning forward. "We've consulted Dr. Albright. He thinks you may be showing signs of senile paranoia. Grief can twist the mind, Mom. Make you imagine things." My hands trembled beneath the table, but I kept my voice steady. "Imagine things. Like your father's poisoning." The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, I saw their masks slip the flash of panic, the flicker of guilt. Then Charles spoke, smooth as oil. "Mom, there was no poisoning. Dad had an accident. You're letting grief confuse you." I leaned closer, locking my eyes on his. "Then why is there no accident report? Why did the police tell me your father had methanol in his blood? Why is the shop perfectly clean, every machine intact?" Henry's face blanched, his eyes darting to Charles for help. Jasmine's lips parted, but she stayed silent, her fingers tightening around the pastry bag. Charles forced a laugh, though his eyes were sharp as knives. "Mom, not every accident requires a police report, and Dad must have been working on something he didn't tell you about. As for the methanol, maybe the doctors were mistaken. You're letting your imagination run wild." I almost laughed at the audacity. They wanted me to doubt myself. They wanted me to believe my grief had twisted into madness. "Mom," Jasmine said sweetly, her voice dripping like honey laced with arsenic, "we only want what's best for you. That's why we think it's time you moved somewhere safe, a place with care. A specialized community for people in grief." The word community rang like a curse. Charles leaned closer, lowering his voice as if offering kindness. "We've already spoken with Judge Miller. If you agree voluntarily, it'll be easier. But if not, we can petition the court to declare you mentally incompetent. We have statements. We have medical reports." My heart slammed against my ribs. They weren't just trying to poison me, they were building a legal cage to trap me. I forced myself to feign calm. "Let me think about it," I said softly. "I need time." "Of course," Jasmine replied, her saccharine tone grating. "But not too much time. For your own good." When they finally left, the house fell into silence again. I pressed my hands to my face, my tears scalding. My own children were plotting to erase me physically or legally. As night fell, my phone buzzed again. "Margot, this is Stephen Callahan. I'm a private investigator. Ernest hired me 3 weeks before his death because he suspected Charles and Henry. They poisoned him with methanol. I have recordings, photos, everything. Meet me tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the corner cafe, back table." My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might split open. Ernest had known. He had not only suspected, he had acted. And now, even from the grave, his precautions were reaching me. I clutched the phone, whispering into the darkness, "Oh, Ernest, you were right. You tried to protect me even in death." And for the first time since his funeral, I felt something new. Not just grief, not just fear, but the smallest spark of hope. The cafe on the corner of Main Street had always been an unremarkable place, a spot where neighbors gossiped over pie and truckers drank black coffee between long hauls. But on that day, at exactly 3 o'clock, it became the stage where my world tilted permanently. I had dressed carefully, choosing Ernest's favorite color, a deep purple dress, pressed and clean. I wanted to feel steady, dignified, even as my heart rattled inside my chest like a trapped bird. Every step from my front porch to that cafe felt like walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss. When I entered, the warm smell of coffee and baked bread wrapped around me, almost mocking in its ordinariness. People chatted, spoons clinked, a child laughed. Didn't they know the earth had split beneath my feet? I forced myself to walk calmly to the back table, my palms damp, my knees trembling. At exactly 3, a tall man with gray hair and eyes that seemed to weigh everything approached. He carried a brown folder tucked under his arm. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked softly. "Yes," I whispered. "I'm Stephen Callahan. I worked with Ernest." He sat down, placing the folder on the table with deliberate care. "I'm sorry we meet under such circumstances. Your husband was a good man." The sound of Ernest's name cracked something inside me. Tears welled, but I bit them back. "You sent the messages?" "Yes. Ernest hired me 3 weeks before his death. He told me he feared your sons. He asked me to keep watch. And he was right." My hands shook as I reached for the folder. "Show me." Stephen opened it and pulled out a small recorder. He pressed play. At first, only static, then a voice. A voice I knew better than my own heartbeat. Ernest. "Stephen, I need this on record. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Charles and Henry are pushing me to increase my life insurance. They say it's to protect Margot. But I read the fine print. There are clauses that benefit them directly. I don't trust them. I can't say this to Margot yet. But I'm afraid." I covered my mouth, the sound escaping me half sob, half gasp. Hearing his voice again was like being stabbed and embraced at the same time. Stephen's voice was gentle. "There's more." Another recording. This time, Charles's voice. Cold, businesslike. "We can't wait any longer. The old man is suspicious. He asked me why I keep asking about his insurance. I've already bought the methanol. It works perfectly. Looks like a stroke or a heart attack. Mom won't know what hit her." My stomach lurched. The cafe walls seemed to close in. I pressed my fist to my lips, trembling violently. Stephen pressed play again. Henry's voice now, casual, cruel. "Everything's ready. Charles will slip it into his coffee. We told him it was a vitamin supplement. He's gullible enough to drink it. First dizziness, then blindness, then coma. By the time doctors realize, it'll be too late. The insurance money will be ours. And Mom, well, she'll be so broken we can handle her however we want." My tears spilled freely, dripping onto the wooden table. The man who had sat on my porch telling stories, who had fixed their toys with patient hands, who had taught them how to cast lines into the river those boys had become executioners. "How?" My voice cracked. "How did you get this?" "Ernest suspected long before he died," Stephen explained. "He asked me to plant listening devices in your home phone and in the shop. He wanted evidence. He didn't know exactly what they planned, but he feared his time was short." He slid photographs across the table. Charles, caught on camera at a hardware store, buying a small bottle. The date was stamped. 5 days before Ernest's death. "Here," Stephen said, producing more papers. Bank records. Charles and Henry were spending far more than they earned. Charles owed $70,000 to a city lender. Henry had $40,000 in gambling debts. They were drowning. Ernest's life insurance was their lifeline. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Greed, debt, desperation. They hadn't just stumbled into betrayal, they had planned it meticulously. "There's more," Stephen said quietly, almost reluctant. He pressed play one final time. Charles's voice again. "After Dad, we need to deal with Mom. She's sharp, too sharp. If she starts asking questions, we're finished. We'll stage it as suicide. A grieving widow who couldn't live without her husband. No one will question it. We'll inherit everything. 200,000, maybe more." The recorder clicked off. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. I sat rigid, my chest heaving. My hands clawed at the letter in my purse, Ernest's last words, warning me not to trust our sons. He had known. He had seen what I, blinded by maternal love, refused to see. Stephen's eyes softened. I know this is unbearable, but with these recordings, the photographs, the bank records, we have enough. If you take this to the police, they can't escape. My voice shook. They murdered him. And they want me gone, too. My own children. Stephen reached across the table, placing a steady hand over mine. Margot, listen to me. They are no longer your children. They are criminals. Ernest's foresight gave you the weapon to fight back. Now you must use it. I nodded slowly, though my body trembled. I had walked into that cafe broken, unsure of my sanity. I left with a folder that proved my worst nightmare and gave me the path to justice. As I stepped into the fading afternoon light, one thought carried me. Ernest had not died in vain. His love had left me a shield. And now, I would wield it against the very sons who had betrayed him. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder open in front of me. The little recorder, the photographs, the bank records, all of it lay there like a pile of daggers. Every page was a wound, but also a weapon. I could barely breathe under the weight of it, but Stephen's words echoed in my head. Ernest gave you the weapon. Now you must use it. At dawn, Stephen knocked on my door. His face was tired but resolute. Are you ready? I looked at him, clutching Ernest's letter to my chest. I've been ready since the moment they put him in the ground. We drove to the police station in silence, the roads eerily empty, as though the world itself held its breath. Sergeant O'Connell was on duty, sipping his morning coffee. When he saw us, he stood quickly. Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Callahan, is everything all right? I placed the folder on his desk with trembling hands. No, Sergeant, nothing is all right. My husband was murdered. By my own sons. For the next 2 hours, we laid it all out, the recordings of Charles and Henry plotting, the photographs of Charles buying methanol, the suspicious bank withdrawals, Ernest's notes warning of his son's intentions. O'Connell listened in stunned silence, his pen frozen above his notepad. When the last recording ended, Henry's voice casually describing how they'd fake my suicide, the sergeant swore under his breath. Good Lord, I've seen some ugly cases, but this is monstrous. Will you act? I demanded, my voice trembling with both fear and fury. He nodded sharply. We'll need confirmation from the medical examiner. If Ernest was poisoned, it'll be in his system. But with this evidence, I have enough to request immediate warrants. We'll take them in before they can run or hurt you. For the first time in weeks, I felt something crack open inside me. Relief. Hope. Ernest's killers, my own sons, would finally face justice. By evening, the exhumation order was signed. The district attorney himself came down to review the case. We move at dawn, he said grimly. We want them in custody before they can destroy evidence or flee. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in Ernest's old armchair, the one where he used to read the paper, staring at the window. My phone buzzed twice, calls from Charles, then Henry, but I didn't answer. I knew they were plotting. They had likely sensed I was no longer under their control. At 6 a.m, my phone rang again. This time, Charles's voice. Too calm, too rehearsed. Mom, you need to come to Henry's house right away. Something terrible happened. My blood ran cold. The trap. I'll come, I lied, my voice steady. But instead of driving to Henry's, I stayed put, watching from my window as, an hour later, 3 police cruisers sped down the street toward my sons' homes. My phone buzzed nonstop, first desperate calls, then angry voicemails. I ignored every one. At 9, Sergeant O'Connell knocked on my door. Mrs. Hayes, it's done. Charles and Henry are in custody. Both are charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. My knees gave way. Stephen caught me by the arm, steadying me as tears streamed down my face. How did they react? I whispered. The sergeant's jaw tightened. Charles denied everything at first until we played him the recordings. Then he broke down, sobbing like a child. Henry tried to run. We chased him 6 blocks before he gave up. The image of my sons, once innocent boys splashing in the river, now handcuffed criminals, stabbed at my heart. But alongside the grief was steel. Ernest's murder would not be buried in silence. That afternoon, as news spread through Spring Creek, Jasmine appeared at my door, mascara streaked down her cheeks. "Mrs. Hayes, please," she sobbed. "Drop the charges. Charles isn't a bad man. He was desperate, pressured by his debts. I pushed him too hard. It's my fault, too." I looked at her without an ounce of pity. "Your fault? You stood beside him. You encouraged him. My husband is dead because of both of you. And they were planning to kill me, too. But we're family," she cried. "The family I had died the moment you and my sons decided Ernest's life was worth money," I said coldly. "Get off my porch." She left wailing, but my resolve didn't falter. I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. Later that evening, Stephen returned, carrying the preliminary report from the medical examiner. The words burned into my eyes. Lethal levels of methanol consistent with deliberate poisoning. Proof. Final, undeniable proof. I pressed the paper to my chest, whispering into the quiet, "Ernest, my love, you were right. You saw the danger. And now, justice is coming." For the first time since that text message at the funeral, I felt safe. Not because the nightmare was over, it had only just begun in court, but because I had survived. And Ernest's killers would never hurt anyone again. The trial of State versus Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes began 2 months later, but for me, the days leading up to it felt like years. The case had spread across every corner of Spring Creek. Neighbors whispered in grocery aisles, reporters parked their vans outside my gate, and even strangers would stop me on the street, their eyes wide with sympathy or morbid curiosity. On the morning of the first hearing, I stood before my mirror, smoothing the wrinkles of the black dress I had chosen. Not the one I wore to Ernest's funeral, no. That dress carried too much grief. Instead, I wore the one from our wedding anniversary dinner years ago. It symbolized dignity, loyalty, endurance, qualities Ernest had lived by and qualities I would need in court. Stephen arrived to escort me, his presence steady as a lighthouse. As we walked into the courthouse, cameras flashed, voices shouted questions. "Mrs. Hayes, how do you feel knowing your own sons are on trial for your husband's murder?" I kept my head high. I would not let them see me break. The courtroom was overflowing neighbors, former co-workers of Ernest, even people from neighboring towns. The betrayal had struck a chord across the community. At the prosecution's table, the district attorney spread the evidence Stephen had collected: photographs, documents, the little recorder. At the defense's side, Charles and Henry sat in orange prison jumpsuits, their wrists cuffed, their faces pale. When I looked at them, my heart twisted. I saw not the men who had plotted Ernest's death, but flickers of the boys I once knew. The boys who used to run barefoot through the fields, who laughed until their stomachs hurt, who cried for me when they scraped their knees. But those boys were gone, buried long before their father. The judge's gavel thundered. Court is now in session. The prosecutor began with devastating precision. He played the recordings, one by one. Charles's voice: "I've already bought the methanol. It'll look like a stroke." Henry's voice: "Mom will be too broken to question anything." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I felt dozens of eyes on me, but I kept mine fixed on the recorder, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. Then came the photographs Charles leaving the hardware store with the bottle. The bank statements showing suspicious withdrawals. Ernest's own handwritten notes, warning me not to trust our sons. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of their defense. When it was my turn to testify, my legs trembled as I walked to the stand. The oath felt heavy in my mouth. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." "Mrs. Hayes," the prosecutor asked gently, "can you describe your relationship with your sons before your husband's death?" I swallowed hard. I thought it was good. I raised them with love. I gave them everything. Ernest worked himself to the bone to put food on the table. We believed we had a close family. But somewhere along the way, money twisted them. They stopped visiting, stopped calling. They looked at us with shame, as though we weren't enough. "And did you ever imagine," the prosecutor pressed, "that they could harm their father?" I shook my head, my voice cracking. "Never. That is the cruelty of it. I trusted them completely. When they said Ernest had an accident, I believed them. When they rushed the funeral, I thought they were grieving. But all along they were hiding their crime." Across the room, Charles dropped his head into his hands, shoulders shaking. Henry stared at me defiantly, though I saw moisture glisten in his eyes. The defense tried to argue desperation, that debt and stress had driven them to madness, that they weren't truly monsters, only men cornered by circumstance. But when the prosecutor played the recording of them discussing my suicide, the courtroom erupted. People gasped, some shook their heads, others whispered in horror. The judge banged his gavel until silence fell again. On the third day, the medical examiner testified. The exhumation of Mr. Ernest Hayes confirmed lethal levels of methanol in his system. This was not an accident, it was deliberate poisoning. His words landed like thunder. Stephen also took the stand. He detailed how Ernest had hired him weeks before his death, how the recordings were made, how he tracked the son's financial desperation. The jury hung on every word, their faces grim. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. The prosecutor's voice rang through the hushed courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not merely a case of greed. This is the cold, calculated betrayal of a father by his own flesh and blood. Ernest Hayes was a husband, a father, a man of dignity, and his sons chose to see him not as a parent, but as a payday. And when their greed wasn't enough, they plotted to murder their own mother. If this is not premeditated, deliberate murder, what is? When the jury filed out, the silence was unbearable. I sat clutching Ernest's letter in my lap, whispering prayers. 6 hours later, they returned. The foreman stood. In the case of the state versus Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes, on the charge of first-degree murder of Ernest Hayes, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit the murder of Margot Hayes, we find the defendants guilty. The courtroom gasped, then erupted. My breath hitched, my heart racing. Guilty. The word rang like a bell of justice. The judge's voice was stern, final. Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes, for the crime of first-degree murder and conspiracy, I sentence you both to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 30 years. Charles collapsed into his chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Henry's face went slack, pale as chalk. The gavel struck again, sealing their fate. As they were led away in handcuffs, Charles turned his tear-streaked face toward me. His lips moved silently. "I'm sorry." But no sound came. I sat frozen, my hands trembling. The sons I had loved were gone forever. In their place stood two murderers, condemned not by strangers, but by their own mother's courage to speak the truth. When the courtroom emptied, Stephen walked me out, steadying me with his arm. Reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed, but I barely heard them. All I could hear was Ernest's voice in my heart. "Don't trust them, Margot. Protect yourself." I had. And now justice was done. When the gavel struck for the last time and Charles and Henry were led away in chains, the courtroom emptied, but I remained seated for a long while. My hands trembled, clutching Ernest's letter so tightly the paper nearly tore. Justice had been served, yet my heart felt as if it had been hollowed out. I had won the war, but lost my sons forever. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, but their voices sounded muffled, as though I were underwater. Stephen shielded me with his arm and guided me past them. "Let's go home," he murmured, and the word home filled me with bittersweet warmth. Home. The little house with its leaking roof, its creaky floorboards, and its garden that Ernest once tended. It was all I had left, but it was enough. The weeks after the trial passed in a blur. Neighbors came by with casseroles, flowers, and sympathetic words. Doris held me while I cried on nights when grief broke through my composure. Sometimes, when I stood in the kitchen, I almost expected Ernest to walk in, wiping grease off his hands, asking what was for dinner. Instead, silence answered me. Silence, and the weight of memory. But grief did not crush me as I had feared. Something else began to grow in its place: purpose. Ernest's death could not be undone, but perhaps his story could prevent others from suffering in silence. With the insurance money, I established the Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes. At first, it was just a small office in town, with one lawyer and a part-time counselor, but word spread. Soon, families from nearby counties began reaching out: wives threatened by greedy relatives, parents manipulated by children, people who suspected foul play but were too afraid to speak. One woman, Eleanor, told me her brother had poisoned their mother for her inheritance. She said she never would have had the courage to confront him if she hadn't read about my case in the newspaper. When her brother was convicted months later, she hugged me with tears streaming down her face. "You saved me, Mrs. Hayes. Your story saved me." It was then I realized Ernest had not died in vain. His love, his foresight, his courage, they lived on in the families we were helping, and in that, his legacy became something greater than tragedy. It became hope. Life settled into a new rhythm. Every Sunday, I visited Ernest's grave with fresh flowers from the garden I had made in his old workshop. Sunflowers, red roses, carnations, bright bursts of life against the cold stone. I would sit on the grass, talk to him about the week, about the foundation, about the families who had found justice because of him. Sometimes the breeze would stir through the trees, and I would feel his presence, quiet and proud. Charles and Henry remained in prison. News reached me occasionally. Charles had attempted to appeal, but the evidence was overwhelming. Henry had been moved to the prison psychiatric wing after suffering repeated breakdowns. I received letters from them, incoherent apologies scrawled in desperate handwriting. At first, I read them, searching for some trace of the boys I once knew, but eventually, I stopped opening them. I had to protect my peace. My forgiveness, if it ever came, would be between me and God. As for Jasmine, she disappeared from Spring Creek soon after the sentencing. Rumors said she changed her name and moved to the city. Perhaps she wanted to outrun the stain of being married to a murderer. Perhaps she simply couldn't bear the weight of what she had been complicit in. I no longer cared. 5 years later, on the anniversary of Ernest's death, I organized a memorial service through the foundation. More than 200 people came, families we had helped, neighbors, officials, even strangers who had read about our work. Stephen gave a speech that brought tears to every eye. Evil tried to silence Ernest Hayes, but his story lives on as a beacon of truth. Because of him, countless families have found the courage to seek justice. As I listened, I felt tears slide down my cheeks, not of grief, but of pride. Ernest was gone, but he had left behind something indestructible. That night, sitting on my porch with a cup of tea, Stephen beside me, I looked out over the quiet street. The stars shone faintly, and I thought of all that had happened. The betrayal, the loss, the trial, the redemption. I whispered into the night, "Ernest, my love, I kept my promise. I found the truth. I sought justice, and I turned our pain into hope for others." And for the first time in years, my chest felt light. Did you like my story? And tell me, where are you listening from? I'd love to know in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and support the channel. Your encouragement helps me bring more true-to-life stories of justice, betrayal, and resilience. On the screen, you'll find 2 more stories that I think you'll love. Don't miss them. Until next time, thank you for listening.